Hey, this is Steve. I thought what I would do in introducing Barbara Biesecker's essay, Rethinking the Rhetorical Situation from Within the Thematic of Différance, I thought what I would do for a change of pace is make a little movie. And actually, I think it's kind of fitting with how this all works out. So let me try to give you some just brief introductory sort of comments here. Um, First off, what Bisecker is basically saying at the beginning of the essay, and I'm thinking here are the first 3 or 4 pages, is that despite the fact that Bitzer and Watts disagree on things, obviously, and that there has been disagreement since Bitzer on the nature of the rhetorical situation, pretty much everybody agrees on this. That is that basically what you've got in rhetorical situations is you've got a rhetor, you've got an audience speaking to an audience, and then there's a messenger. Now, the debate really between Bitzer and Watts, to be very simplistic about it, and this is what Bisecker also talks about to a certain extent in on page 250, 235 or so, is that we can debate where the exigency of this is this the result of the rhetor that's over here controlling his or her destiny and controlling the message, or is the exigence just out there in the world? That is, situations happen, and rhetors come across them. But this is the important but that Bisecker is getting at. Basically, everybody up to this point has agreed on these constituents. In other words, no one has problematized the fact that these things are discrete. So on page, and in effect, what as a result of that, Vatz accepts that through his argument with it. So on page 235, when she says, as already noted, Vatz's ostensive purpose is to propose an alternative to Bitzer's definition of rhetoric and the rhetorical situation. Whether or not we agree with Vatz's own proposition, we may at least see his essay as a successful counterstatement. I certainly do. Nevertheless, and this is the mark of the double gesture that inhabits his own writing, even as it questions the validity of Bitzer's central proposition, Vatz's essay simultaneously confirms it. After all, Vatz's statement is a response to Bitzer's essay. Vatz reads the rhetorical situation as itself a situation with an exigence that invites a response. So in other words, he reads the essay, the rhetorical situation, as a situation. And yet, is not Vatz's own article an effect of arbitration on the part of a choosing individual? So then, is Bitzer right or is Vatz right? Is situation or speaker the origin of rhetorical discourse? So in other words, there's a play between those two things and acceptance of constituents. Okay. So then she starts talking about difference. And there's a couple things I need to sort of explain here that she doesn't talk about as clearly as she perhaps could. The first thing is she alludes to this idea of, and I believe this is on 236. Yeah, 236. She talks about the idea of signifiers and signifieds. Okay, so let me read from a brief passage from Terry Eagleton, A Literary Theory Introduction, which is an excellent book on all kinds of critical theory ideas. And this is a little bit about structuralism and semiotics. He's talking about like here about what he does in this book is he talks about different critical movements in the 20th century to talk about like what basically give an introduction to literary theory. So he talks about Ferdinand de Saussure. And Saussure is one of the people who popularized the idea of structuralist notions of language. So he says here, I'll merely sketch out a few of his central positions. Saussure viewed language as a system of signs which was to be studied synchronically. That is to say, studied as a complete system at a given point in time, rather than diachronically in its historical development. And that's important because this is one of the terms that comes up later on. Each sign was to be seen as being made up of a signifier, a sound, image, or graphic equivalent, and a signify, the concept or meaning. Now, the example he has here is, I'll read this, the 3 black marks CAT are a signifier which evoke the signified cat in the English mind. The relationship between the signifier and signified is an arbitrary one. There's no inherent reason why these 3 marks should mean cat. So, for example, just to sort of like get us straight here for this, this is a signifier. Okay, this is a this is a signifier. That's a signified. Okay, and there's no reason why this and this is not inherent. That's just arbitrary, right? We call it had as opposed to whatever. Also, this could mean this, or it could mean this, or it could mean any other number of other kinds of hats. Okay, good. So there you got that sort of relationship there. The relation between the whole sign and what it refers to, what Saussure calls a referent, the real furry, fur-legged creature, is therefore arbitrary. Each sign in the system has meaning only by virtue of its difference from other signs. Cat has meaning not in and of itself, but because it is not cap or cat or bat. It does not matter how the signifier alters as long as it preserves the difference of all other signifieds. You can pronounce in many different accents as long as the difference is maintained. In other words, we understand what things are by what they are not. Okay? This is important. Then Saussure also talks about the idea that there's a difference between parole and langue. And parole is essentially what people actually say. But langue is a sort of almost Platonic-like ideal in terms of signifier, signified. Okay, so then we get to Derrida. And what does he do with this? Well, there's two things that he does with this that are very important. The first thing he does that I think we talked about before in this book by Peggy Kampf. You see this? There it is. She points out that différance is a kind of important word in French that doesn't necessarily translate well in English. And here's the important thing. In French, it's the same word, to differ and to defer. And the way that you decide it is by context. And what Derrida is doing here is he's trying to combine the concept of differing and deferring into one thing. So in other words, différance is essentially a pun, meaning both to differ and to defer. Now, this is how Eagleton talks about this a little bit later on. Eagleton points out, and this is the chapter on post-structuralism, which is where our friend Derrida comes into play. The post-structuralists pointed out, well, wait a minute, if you know what hat is not cat or cad, well, then how do you know what cat is? Well, cat is not bat or bad. Well, how do you know what bad is? Well, bad is not, and so on. In other words, the post-structuralists point out, well, this is a never-ending chain of signifiers here. So Derrida points out here that, and others, another way of putting it is we've just said is that meaning is not immediately present in the sign. Since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, its meaning is always in some sense absent from it too. Meaning, if you like, is scattered or dispensed along the whole chain of signifiers. It cannot be easily nailed down. It never is fully present in one side alone, but is rather kind of constant flickering or presence of absence together. And this is part of what Biesecker talks about in quoting from Derrida in terms of a trace. And as an example, let me do this. When I read a sentence, the meaning of its, and this is from Eagleton too, when I read a sentence, the meaning of it is always somehow suspended, something deferred or still to come. One signifier relays me to another, and then to another. Earlier meanings are modified by later ones, and all the sentence may come to an end, the process of language itself does not. And that sentence is a really good example of that, because you don't know where I'm going until I get to the end of that sentence, but by then it's too late, because you can't go back, especially if we think of the sign and language in like this context here, an oral context here. Okay, that's part one. We'll come back to part two in just a second.